I'm Sam Thompson. I'm Program Manager at the US-UK Fulbright Commission. Thank you for joining us for this public event in our Across the Pond webinar series, spurring transatlantic conversations between Fulbright scholars. This virtual event series brings together two Fulbright scholars, one from our UK cohort and one from our US cohort, to discuss the intersection between their research interests. Our vision here at the Commission is a world in which there are no obstacles to learning, understanding, and collaboration. And this new series really brings this to life. We really value your participation in our webinar this evening. So far in this series, we've talked about science, from public engagement to COVID to the psychology of trauma. And we've discussed arts, focusing on the role of museums and other cultural institutions in society. And we've heard from scholars who routinely roam into the wild, exploring the national parks of the United Kingdom and the United States. Tonight, we voyage into the realm of photographic memory. Humans seem to be drawing to exploring ruins, be they Pompeii or the haunted house in the neighborhood where you grew up. We walk through the spaces quietly, almost in a reverent state. Often we feel conflicted about our curiosity because we know the story behind the space is rarely a good one, but we are compelled forward. Why do humans visit and revisit spaces of the past? What attracts us to past spaces? Are we violating the space or honoring a past inhabitant? And how does the arc of time change our relationship to these abandoned environments? Before I introduce our two speakers, a little word of housekeeping for the event tonight. First of all, this event is being recorded, so you will have had a little pop-up when you joined the webinar, but we are recording the event tonight, so that does mean that it will be accessible at a later time if you need to dash off or you're worried about missing anything. Plus, you'll be able to go back and find anything you missed. This is also true of all of our previous events and any of our upcoming events in this series. So if there's anything you're interested in that we have covered already or that we're going to cover in the future, please do look out for those recordings if you haven't been able to attend the live broadcast. We also encourage you to engage with the event tonight as well. So we will be having the Q&A box open throughout the event, and we encourage you to ask your questions as they come to you. Don't worry about waiting to the end. We'll try and get to questions as they feel relevant within the conversation itself. And with that out of the way, I'd like to welcome both of our participants this evening. I'm joined by Makoto Takahashi, a lecturer at the Munich Center for Technology in Society and a Fulbright Lloyd Scholar, soon to be hosted at the Kennedy School of Harvard University. His core interests lie in how societies come to understand technological risks and how they decide on who can credibly inform policy. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge and is currently curating a photography exhibit, Picturing the Invisible, which will open at the Royal Geographic Society on the 25th of October, 2021. I'd also like to welcome Laura Migliorino. Laura grew up in Chicago Heights, a suburb of Chicago, and she has a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the School of Art Institute of Chicago and a Master's of Fine Arts from the University of Minnesota. She's a professor of art at the Anoka Ramsey School, a community college near Minneapolis. Her work is in the permanent collection of the Walker Art Center, Weissman Museum in Minneapolis, and she'll be a Fulbright Scholar at the British Library later this year. Laura, welcome. How are you doing?
Good. Everything's great. Good morning from this side of the pond.
And Mac, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Really looking forward to this conversation. Great.
Me too. Well, to get us started, I suppose we should really get into what that introductory spiel that I delivered was about, and the reason that we're here, which is that sense of what is it that draws us to images of disaster and abandonment. Mac, if I could ask you to kick us off, as we have some images actually on the screen right now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the things is that they really speak to a kind of universal theme, right? They speak to the impermanence of all things, to kind of death, decay, decline. These are things that I think all people, but also all peoples, as in all cultures, grapple with. And particularly with these images of abandoned spaces, I think it's very easy for us to insert ourselves into the narrative. The lack of people makes it easy for us to start engaging in that logic of, oh, this could happen to me or to the society that I'm in, kind of there, but for the grace of God, go I type logic. And I think that's really their sort of power and their resonance. There's also a part of me that wonders whether or not that is also the danger of these types of images in a curious way, that they're almost too seductive, too universal. If we take this slideshow that's coming up, you'll notice that one of the pairings is two images of beds in abandoned homes. One taken by Rebecca Bathory, who will be in the Picturing the Invisible exhibit, which was taken in the evacuated territory in Fukushima. And another one, of course, taken by Lara in the US. And they pair so well because they both evoke a kind of unspoken misfortune through this kind of same language, the language of absence. And there was a part of me that, as I was thinking about today's conversation, I was looking at those images and I was almost wondering, if we were to exhibit them side by side and to swap the little plaques as a prank, would anyone immediately twig what we'd done, or would they just kind of lose themselves in admiring that kind of that kind of sublime of decay? But I don't know, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it, Lara.
Well, Mac and I have had wonderful opportunity to talk at length about this topic because there's just so many different offshoots of it. And so as somebody who did a contemporary project on abandoned homes, which I did in the last, 6 or 7 years, it was over a period of 5 years. And there's a little bit of this kind of ruins porn backlash, and just, everybody's doing it. Photographing abandoned malls, photographing abandoned insane islands, and these kinds of things. And but we're drawn to these things, whether I photographed this in 2019 or 2020, or whether it's this house from Pompeii. So if you look at the at the two beds, one disaster begets another disaster. I mean, the house that I photographed is abandoned and we don't really know why. And then it gets squatted by meth addicts and we don't know why. Somebody set the bed on fire, all of these things, but yet they have this sort of universal feeling about them, and we are drawn to them. And we as humans are drawn to these spaces, whether it's a contemporary home or an ancient ruins. And I think, Max got a good point. You take these two photos of these beds, one from a nuclear disaster and then a house in, a small town in Minnesota that's been abandoned for unknown reasons. Although somebody still owns it. Now that we know for a fact, because somebody has to pay the taxes on that property. So it's there, then somebody owns it, but it's unoccupied. And yeah, we could swap those, and you wouldn't necessarily know that this was abandoned because of a nuclear disaster, and this was just abandoned because somebody walked away from it, and then it went into decay. And that human component of why do we want to see these spaces? But we do, whether, like you said, whether it was taken a few years ago or whether it's 3000 BCE and it's Petra. And what is it about human nature that does just draw us to these spaces? And is it ethical? Is another question. So I won't go too much further. So at any rate, it's kind of my introductory thought on these spaces.
Yeah,
I think that question of ethics is the big one. I certainly remember that was something that we'd all talked about before, and I suppose it brings us to this point as well, as not just the ethicality of it, the ethics of it, but also the emotional responses. So, for instance, does one experience a different emotional response to seeing a space or a photograph of a space that we know was the product of a disaster?
Mm-hmm.
So if we want to talk about this example, right, where we know what happened at Fukushima and the outcomes of that and the effect it had on people, whereas, as you say, with the other bed, we don't know the circumstances that led to some of the events in that photo. And do we have different emotional responses to those things? And do you think I suppose, do you think it's a ethically good or bad thing that we feel different responses as well based on knowledge of what happened?
I'll jump in really quick here. I think that if you don't know, I mean, if the viewer doesn't know, they're going to then just come to it with their own emotional responses. So whatever that may be, whether it's something they remember from childhood or it's their own fear of homelessness or something of that nature, they'll come to it separate, with their own. Once you add some information, I think that there's no way that the viewer can't feel differently. A disaster, whether it's a man-made disaster, natural disasters, which are also man-made in many ways, so they kind of go back and forth. I think that instills this fear, like, we think about these forest fires all over. It's terrifying. I think when you look at like this table for 10, you might feel a certain sort of sadness, but you may not feel that sort of like terror that you might feel when you look at if you know the space is the result of its disasters. And I think what happened in this spaces can really change the way the viewer feels about it. So Mac, thoughts on that?
I mean, perhaps to add to that and to really draw out the point that Sam was kind of asking about, not just do we feel differently, which I think you're entirely right, Laura, but that I think it can't help but change our emotional engagement when we're given that information. But, is that a good thing or not?
Right.
My sense would be that it is a good thing, in part because when I was thinking about images of abandonment and the seeming universality of that as a depiction of Fukushima, and one that we're routinely drawn to, that if you look for news articles about Fukushima, the vast majority of photos are of the abandoned territories, not the people living around the abandoned territories kind of struggling to live with radiation, right? This one seductive story starts to become the only story, particularly in our visual language.
Yes.
But also the kind of universality, which I think we both agreed was partly why these images are so seductive, is on some level a lie, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, we all die. Yes, all things decay. But, when you look at the aftermath of a nuclear disaster and think, this could happen to me, there but for the grace of God go I, mm-hmm. It's easy to forget that nuclear reactors aren't just built anywhere, right? There is a kind of politics and economics to this, as well as the kind of more geological factors. No reactor is built in a rich neighborhood or a city, even though cities generate most of the demand that the reactor is built to fulfill. So there is a kind of politics of exposure, which I think can easily be forgotten when we're just engaging with these kind of beautiful images of abandoned open spaces and thinking about these kind of big permanent themes like death. And I think perhaps, realizing that it is a nuclear disaster and that kind of slight shift of our engagement with the image is an opening to start thinking about the specificities of the disaster that people have experienced.
I think that some of these images can be very educational. So it's, some of why I, am an advocate, because it's easy. I think Mac hit one point. It's easy to forget there are people who are living there, and in these, we go way back in history to 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl. Of course, Mac and I've talked at length about that, and if people are attempting to try and survive these man-made disasters, and that I think it's important that like these images can be seductive and they can be really beautiful, and I often like the idea of using that beauty to sort of engage the viewer, and then the next step is to maybe educate them so that maybe they're more sympathetic to the situation in the future. And yes, and if you look at Fukushima, or you look at Chernobyl, or you look at 3 Mile Island, I was just having a conversation about Yucca Mountain with a friend yesterday, which is here in the Western United States. These get placed in areas where the people don't have as much power to say no. What are those political ramifications too, and social? So I do know that so, you know, we have this one side of like, should we be looking at these images for ethical reasons? But then I think on the other side, well, we can use them to be educational or informative, then to me that outweighs sort of the slight guilt that I have when I look at these things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. You know, the point that you're making about using that seduction as an opening.
Yeah.
You know, because certainly when in respect to curating an exhibit about Fukushima, you know, abandonment isn't just seductive, it is this incredibly important theme. You know, there is still a sizable territory that is uninhabitable. There will be a generation of people that can never return to their ancestral homes. And so for that reason, I really had to include the work of someone like Rebecca Bathory, who depicts that so beautifully. But I think you're also right that it's an opportunity to broaden people's perspective, to perhaps change it. That I think often even when I mentioned that I was doing fieldwork in Fukushima, people are surprised that anyone is living there at all. People assume that the entire prefecture, you know, to enter, you have to kind of be hazmated up. And I think they're imagining a far more kind of grand and almost Indiana Jones version of my fieldwork than me wandering around the city where, sure, people are perhaps monitoring their radiation exposure, and you have kind of Geiger counters in public spaces and things like this. But ultimately, life is continuing in a different form. And so, you know, in this sense, I suppose I have an advantage as a curator that perhaps you don't have, Lara, because, you know, as a photographer, you've got to get it in an image. Right. Whereas obviously I can choose to pair images, and that leaves me with the somewhat easier task of including someone like Rebecca Bathory, but also pairing it with other images like the works of Tom Davies that celebrate people, you know, continuing to live, continuing to rebuild their lives in incredibly challenging circumstances.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is just such a rich topic. I will say that when Mac and I first met and started talking, we would find ourselves 2 hours into a conversation, and it just peels back because there's just so many fascinating aspects of it. And one of the things that we talked about, and you can see in the slideshow, is that, you know, why do I feel like it's okay for me to go wander through Pompeii and I don't feel quite so guilty about it? I mean, it was a horrible disaster. My dad's family dates back to Pompeii. I mean, we are descendants of survivors of this disaster, but I don't feel the same way as I do when I look at, you know, a photograph of, you know, Rebecca Bathory's photographs. Is it because it's more contemporary and it hits me? And that people are continuing to live in a place where this horrible, horrible thing happened. And how does, again, that change my relationship or my feelings about those spaces? So we found that part of our conversation really fascinating. So it's why I like my 2 dining rooms here, paired side by side.
I was struck when you were talking about people still living in spaces, and perhaps this is one of the things that's more difficult to show with some of the more ancient examples that we've chosen to use. But do you think there's also a responsibility then of artists or other people working on the memory of disaster to also show the human resilience side of these stories? Because I think that's almost a factor we miss out when we're looking at abandonment as a factor in post-disaster photography, for instance.
Yeah, perhaps I can jump in there. I think you're it's a really interesting question, and I think it touches on something that, you know, Laura was raising, right, about the difference of things being contemporary or ancient. You know, are these people still alive or not? I think intuitively, I want to say, yes, of course, we should celebrate the diversity of the experience. We should also celebrate the stories of resilience. I remember someone, a research informant, when I was interviewing her about her kind of experiences of Fukushima, she kind of described it as a knot. And she said that's why it's so heartbreaking, but also fascinating, because if you tap into that knot, you find all the different strands of human existence, all these different things come together. I think at the same time, we have to be aware of the politics of resilience as well, right? That I think there are an awful lot of people in Japan, and particularly in Fukushima, that also, I think, feel somewhat uneasy with the kind of celebration of Fukushima rising from the ashes. The disaster is over. This is a triumphal story. And they feel that it distracts from a kind of deeper questioning of why the disaster happened at all, and how people have been treated in the wake of the disaster. And, that there are an awful lot of people that quite rightly couldn't face it with great resilience, that it was an overwhelming experience for them, and that there shouldn't be any implicit condemnation of them either. I think in some sense, that's a roundabout way of saying it's always going to be incredibly rich and complicated. And I think part of the beauty of something like photography as a way of engaging with the legacy of a disaster is that you really can try and reflect that multifaceted nature. I don't know, what do you think, Laura?
Well, I think one of the things you just mentioned was photography. I mean, one of the things that makes a big difference is, our relationship to the photographic image in and of itself. I mean, it's a relatively new medium compared to like carving in marble. So we can go thousands of years back. We have a tendency to feel, and I won't go down this rabbit hole too much because I could be here a long time. We have a tendency to feel that photography or the photographic image, and that could be video, photography, film, anything, has a certain sort of accuracy, a certain sort of reality that makes it, fact, and that it can't be distorted. Whereas, when we look back at ancient Pompeii or ancient Rome or Angkor Wat or something like that, we don't have this photo. And I think photography is one of the big things that changes how we relate to these spaces. We can see what, we feel the photograph is giving us a more accurate representation of life, and it happens to be more contemporary than we don't have photos of ancient Pompeii. We don't have that, that medium isn't there yet to sort of like give us this immediate relationship. The relationship we have with these ancient spaces, and it doesn't even have to be ancient, it's just, some old castle in England, so that's only maybe several hundred years old and not thousands of years. We don't have, the photograph in and of itself changes our perception of it. And, any photographer will tell you, you can make something look like it's not. And we do this with the viewer a little bit, and because I want to make the photojournalists are more interested in accuracy. As a fine art photographer, I'm much more interested in aesthetics. Now, when I photographed my abandoned spaces, I did not change anything, but the way that I approach the space with the camera can completely manipulate the viewer's view. I mean, you see that burnt bed, but you have no idea what the rest of the house looks like. Maybe the rest of the house is really beautiful. I mean, it's unlikely, but it could be, I mean, so photography, I think, is a big point here, and also how we feel differently about these spaces, and what does photography do for the legacy? And Mac just kind of introduced me, kind of brought that. That's how we, that's the thread of that conversation is, how does photography change that?
And I think you're entirely right, Laura, to emphasize, the nature of the medium of photography. And you've drawn out something really important, which is our assumption about the kind of truthfulness of photography, right? Which is why the surrealists loved it so much, because then you can really start playing with people.
Absolutely.
I think the other interesting thing for me is there's a kind of immediacy, and particularly, both in the 20th century, an age of print media, and even more so now, in the age of social media and the internet, there's not just the immediacy of, the shutter clicks, you have an image, But now, of course, it can be shared and people can experience the photograph being taken together. You know, and it's perhaps fitting that the slideshow has just changed to the kind of stopped clock, because I was thinking about this as a theme as well, that, you know, in the nuclear age, particularly with Hiroshima, you know, if you go around the Peace Memorial Museum, there are the watches that have stopped at exactly the moment that the bomb has been dropped. But it's also the fact that, you know, in an era of newspaper distribution, which really are kind of bestsellers for a day, as someone once joked, everyone reads about, you know, the disaster at the same time, that even if you didn't have to be in Fukushima to experience the disaster, to see the images of explosions at the reactors, in the same way that, you know, and I think for Japanese people, we often refer to it as 3/11 because it was the 11th of March, in some ways also styled after 9/11. And I do think in both cases, in the same way that people will say, oh, do you remember what you were doing, you know, when the Twin Towers were hit, or when you heard that the Twin Towers had been hit? I think certainly for me, I can remember the exact moment, even though I was in the UK, half a world away, the exact moment in which I saw the news in my local coffee shop. And it is that thing of time stops and there's an immediacy because you see the image and it hits you. And
well, I think that because of that immediacy, you know, it's delivered right to, you know, your living room, you know, live and in person. And then, you know, when you then go back and look at images later, your connection to it, I think, is very powerful, and not as, you know, I mean, whether it's accurate, I can't say, but it's powerful because you relive it in more real time. Whereas without the photographic medium, it's more abstract. I mean, and that's for me. I can't say that's for everybody, but to me, it's more abstract. If I go into an old castle somewhere and think about, you know, you know, the royalty that might have lived there, and then maybe, I mean, you can even look at this with plantations in the South of the United States, and where the slave owners lived versus where the slaves lived. We have few photographs, maybe, but your relationship to that space is not as influenced by that real-time image taking that we have now. And so your relationship to it changes. And photography is powerful in that way. It changes the way we remember things.
Absolutely. I mean, you have an awesome responsibility in that sense, and I think you're entirely right. Photography is so central to memory. And I think particularly, you know, when I think about like the history of nuclear power and nuclear weapons, it's so obvious in the sense that, you know, if I say the atomic bomb, most of us probably not only imagine the mushroom cloud, we're probably all imagining the same photographs of mushroom clouds.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's completely fascinating about how photography becomes sort of for contemporary societies. And I was born in 1959, grew up in the 60s. Much of my childhood is remembered through the photographic images in my mother's scrapbooks. Not necessarily by in my one-on-one memory, but it's synthesized through the photograph. And then I think about, you know, just cultures that are only a few hundred years old who have none of that. And I can't ask them, but I really want to know, how do you remember things prior to photography? Sorry. Okay.
No, I was just thinking about that. I know. Fascinating question.
Our conversations have gone. We haven't even talked about this particular topic that I just happened to land on.
No. I was just thinking. In some sense, I'm the wrong person to ask in that. I don't remember a pre-photography age, and I don't think anyone on this call does.
That's what I mean. Yeah, I mean, even my parents' generation. I mean, my mom, was born in 1930, and her mother loved cameras, and so I mean, if I could have a conversation with somebody, maybe it'd be like, hey, somebody from the 1600s. How do you remember things without photography as this conduit for you? Right.
Well, I think it's an interesting point as well, given in the modern day, I think we take more photos than ever before, but we probably look at fewer photos. When was the last time you took out a family photo album and looked through it? Whereas even in my childhood, that was a thing people did. And I think in the last 10 years, we look at fewer of our photos, and we even have temporary photographic medium, things like Instagram stories, disappear after 24 hours. And so photography has almost gone from being a permanent, immediate record to being a snapshot in a moment that's gone. And I think that's a really interesting future for the medium, as well as how does it relate to the future of our memory as a society, as well as our current memory.
Right.
And I think that, it also goes back to the ethics of photography. I mean, that's kind of, another factor here. So why do I not feel guilty taking that beautiful photo of Ephesus when I was there? I'm not going, oh, that's so bad. I feel bad. I don't know what happened to those people. I mean, whereas this photograph, which was taken at, these are kids' clothing, taking at a abandoned halfway house for disturbed youth here in Minnesota. And the whole time I'm there, I'm hating my guts, but yet I want to get the photo and I shouldn't say hating my guts, but definitely questioning my ethics. Right. And so why do I feel a little uncomfortable taking this one photo, and then I'm at Ephesus and I'm snapping away and I'm not thinking twice about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I also wanted to come back to what Sam was saying there about like our changing relationship to photography. Because, even as I was speaking earlier about kind of the history of nuclear photography in particular, I was kind of wondering, like, what is the iconic photo of Fukushima? And I'm not sure I can point to one in quite the way that if you said, well, what is the iconic photo of the Trinity bomb tests? Or what are the iconic photos of Hiroshima? I think if we were to, go away and pick the ones that we think kind of represent the incident, we'd probably pick largely the same photos.
Yes, we probably would. I know exactly the photo I would pick for Hiroshima.
Right. Yeah. And I wonder whether or not that is something about the way in which print media, in particular kind of national newspapers and photojournalism, and everyone seeing the same image on the same day helps create a kind of national consciousness, a kind of collective consciousness around certain images. Whereas, as Sam was kind of saying, with an Instagram story, well, unless you are the world's most popular Instagram influencer, you are not getting to everyone in the nation. Even if you're getting to everyone in the nation, you're not getting to just everyone in the nation in the way that I think with, say, national newspapers, you're also creating a collective memory, right? It is a national memory. You all read the same newspapers, saw the same images. Right. Whereas not only does it feel like the images are less permanent, there are more of them, we move on from them quicker, but also the communities that gather around the image, like as it's produced, seem far less territorialized, far more fragmented, far different.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, Mac.
No, I was just going to finish it with a question for you, which was just to say, I wonder what that is going to do to use our title, to photographic memory, and whether or not you grapple with that as a photographer.
Well, I think the I think Sam hits a really good point, is that we take tons and tons. I mean, I've got thousands I'm a photographer and I have thousands of photos from my phone, and am I really thinking about what I'm taking, and unless I'm really working, behind the camera. I think what's interesting is that, like, I can think of when I was I don't know, maybe 9 years old, is when the Manson murders happened in California. And I remember like that, a photo on the front of the Chicago Tribune. And we all, like you said, we all collectively saw that photo. If I fast forward, somebody who lives in Minneapolis, only less than a mile away from where George Floyd was murdered, I have many more, not like one iconic image. I have, you know, literally, if somebody says George Floyd, for me, hundreds of images begin to go through my mind very rapidly. And so in a sense, the single image had much more of a impact on me. And whereas all this multiple photos, I find that I have to kind of like, sorry, there's a siren outside. I have to kind of like work through them, and it's a little more distracting in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? Right, that barrage, you know. I can't remember his name, but a kind of a late great scholar, I think, joked that you know, the problem with the age of the internet is that it's an era in which no one is bored and everything is boring, you know.
It's just, yeah, and so fast forward 100 years, 200 years, you know, what's the conversation going to be amongst this group of Fulbright scholars about photography and memory? I have no idea, but it's going to be different. And you know, and the photo is going to influence culture in a very different way than it did now, and it did when it first started, and then the image making prior to the advent of the camera.
I wonder if we could get some of our questions in the chat.
Yeah, that would be great, because we'll just keep going off.
Yeah, we've had a host of really great ones get in. And also I want to get to a question that we talked about before, towards the end of this. So the first question that we have that I think is pretty interesting, going back to thinking about what we were talking about a little earlier, but I wondered if the questioner asks if perhaps either of you could reflect a little bit on private versus public space. So Pompeii, for instance, is despite being a disaster site, is a public space prepared specifically for tourism, whereas entering an abandoned private house is decidedly not. It's, I suppose, an authentic relationship with that space. Could
I'll
you
answer that one quickly, and then, you know, Mac will have probably a response. Yes, I think that your relationship to it is completely different. I've been to Pompeii and a number of sites. I'm not feeling anxious. I don't think something's going to jump out of the woodwork. I'm not feeling I'll be arrested. You know, your relationship to those spaces is very different. And I think that does skew how you feel about them. Your ethic, your moral judgment, your ethics. So you go to Pompeii, it's a public space, there are tourists there. It's clearly an educational experience. You know, they're inviting people in to see this disaster site for, you know, cultural and educational purposes and history. I always said about my abandoned homes, I never broke in. So I didn't break and enter, I just entered. So I had to find a way to breach them. And I would dress up as a utility worker and as a white middle-aged woman with a hard hat on, a vest and a clipboard, and nobody stopped me from going in. But there is a different feeling as the photographer going into those spaces, where I did feel more of a moral quandary. And I would say that the response to those photographs, the viewer has a similar response to that photograph, as opposed to maybe, I took some wonderful pinhole photos of Pompeii a few years ago. Very different feelings the viewer has, and it's the same difference that I had in those spaces. So I think public versus private is hugely important.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I'd entirely agree that I think there is obviously a great difference between photographing public spaces and private spaces. I think when it comes to Fukushima, there's also the kind of restricted space versus the non-restricted space, that when we're talking photos of abandonment, these largely focus on the evacuated territories, where unless you have certain permits and permissions, you can't be taken in. I think for certainly a lot of researchers who want to visit the evacuated area, but also photographers who want to produce work there, in some ways this might help negotiate the ethical quandary that they have about photographing private space, because I think usually people are taken in as a guest, right? So you will often be visiting a village with some of the residents of the village. In many places, residents, even if they're not allowed to live there because the levels of radiation that are considered too high, are allowed to visit a certain number of times a day. That relationship also creates different geographies, right? Because even within these quote unquote abandoned homes, you know, some aren't really abandoned in the same way because they're in areas where people expect the levels of radiation to come down sufficiently, and in some places it already has, that the evacuation orders will be lifted and they'll be able to go back in. So they're often slightly derelict, but more just kind of unlived in for sort of half a year at a time, say, you know, and people are going in periodically to take care of the house. That itself produces really interesting stories. I know people that have accompanied people, you know, residents from evacuated territories that go back in. And they said, well, it's really heartbreaking for some of these residents, because I think one was telling the story of a family where I think wild boars kept breaking into their house. And so every time they go back a couple of months later, the ground floor has been completely trashed. You know, animals have broken in, and they have to go through this entire process of cleaning their home, sort of unabandoning it, reclaiming it, only to then be forced to abandon it for a period of months again, and to start the cycle all over again.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's an amazing story.
So another question that we have from our audience is on ethics and positionality. So this is from another photographer who says that in their photography, they're very interested in how people are present without being physically in frame. And being torn between the educational objective of using photography to repopulate spaces that are wrongly framed as empty or even wilderness, and the ethical dilemma of whose story this is to tell. When people are absent, they can't give consent, and photographers becomes the only voice heard. Do you think this dilemma can ever be overcome?
That is a great question, and it's a quandary. I mean, who am I to, I don't know who lived in these houses, and it's some general maybe sometimes. Sometimes I have permission, most times I don't. And there's a little bit of arrogance. I mean, really, any photographer, I think, there's some arrogance, and some great legacy photographers talk about that, like Henri Cartier-Bresson. Who am I to go and capture this, and control the narrative of this space, and potentially control the narrative about whoever lived in these houses or owns them. And I am acutely aware of my responsibility, my privilege. I think that's, but I do think that is one of those ethical quandaries, and again, that changes, be that public-private space. I mean, I'm interloping into this house. I'm not invited, unlike, some of what Mac talked about with people being invited into these spaces in Fukushima. And there is a question like, who am I? Just because I have a camera and I got some time on my hands and I can go do this. I think it's a quandary that I deal with. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there's a certain amount of like, I kind of feel like sometimes I feel a little bit like I'm shady or stealing. But then I also feel like this is a story that needs to be told. And I'm hoping that my photos are open enough that people can create maybe their own stories about what's happening. And many of these houses are inhabited by squatters. And so I'm going into their home that they're living in illegally. I'm in there illegally. And I'm showing the world, their private space, but their private space. So there's a lot in that. That's a deep quandary, and it is one that I am not unfamiliar with, and it's one that I certainly grapple with, and I tell my students that too. You have a responsibility. So I don't have an answer to that question other than it skews different directions, kind of depending on the argument.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fantastic question. I think it's an incredibly difficult one. And certainly all of the photographers that I'm exhibiting, all of the ones that I've had the chance to speak with at length, I think have grappled with it in some way, and often twinned it with the more general question of, is it all right to produce art about suffering and disaster in some way, to create things that people find beautiful and to find it beautiful? Can I produce this work in good conscience? Should people be enjoying it in good conscience? But I think the other interesting thing for me when I was thinking about the various people that I was exhibiting is that most of them, in some sense paralleling myself as a researcher, have been drawn to the site of disaster, right? They've set out to make work about, Fukushima after 3/11. There's one exception to this, and one of her pieces has just popped up on screen, which is Lyoko Shiger, who is fascinating. She doesn't actually live in Fukushima, she lives in the neighboring Miyagi, but an area, again, very heavily affected by 3/11. And I think she's unique in that she had moved to this little coastal village, I think in 2008. So a few years beforehand, had already become very much the village photographer, produces these beautiful kind of Gothic images, which are often about exploring kind of dreams and nightmares. And then very much became the village photographer through and about the disaster in a different way, or rather in two ways. One was that, she continued to produce work that was informed both by her own personal experience, but also, her embeddedness in the community and what other people around her were kind of telling her about, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. She also became responsible for the photographs of the community in a kind of self-appointed role in a very different way, which was that, photographs float. And when the tsunami hit, there was this phenomenon of, family photographs being spread all across that coastline. And people started, as they were doing cleanup efforts, lots of people volunteered and would pick up the photographs and take it to local town halls or like evacuation shelters so that people would have the opportunity to try and reclaim their photographs. And as she was, the kind of resident photographer, she felt that she should play an active role in this. And I believe that she very proactively started getting involved in like cleaning all the dirt off the photographs, trying to match photographs to specific families, collecting them together, and then taking them to people in the community. And she has fascinating stories about that, and that, obviously some people were moved in the sense of being incredibly grateful. But she also had a couple of stories of people who really weren't pleased to be confronted with these lost photographs, that these memories and these images of the life that they had before were painful for them, and they wished that they hadn't seen them again. So even there, right there, even if you're embedded in that community, the questions of what your positionality is, by what right do you take these actions, both in your work but also in relation to photographs in this kind of more expanded role that she fulfilled, don't disappear.
That's an amazing story. Yeah, that's really powerful.
So there's a couple of other questions that I would like to get to, but I'm also conscious of time. So I might do the thing that we discussed that we wanted to talk about. And then if there's some time afterwards, we can get to these last couple of questions. So we've talked a lot today about memory and the role that photography plays in memory, and that intersection with disaster, be it man-made, be it natural. And I wonder, on the other hand, can a case be made for forgetting? and what is that case, and the ethics of that case as well. See.
Well, to some extent, it's kind of like the story that Mac just told about some people were not happy, while her gesture was beautiful, but some people were not happy or pleased to have their photographs returned to them because it was just incredibly painful. And I think that, maybe, what is it that drives us to like obsessively want to remember these places? So let's just go back to something like Pompeii, where we have much more distant relationship to it. Why do we as humans want to preserve these sites? And you can mention thousands of sites around the world: Stonehenge, Angkor Wat, the terracotta warriors in China, go through all of them. And we want to remember. There's some reason we want to remember. And I have a whole bunch of ideas why, but maybe is it better for us as humans or culture to forget? I mean, the only reason that I would think forgetting is not a good thing is those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, which my mother said to us endlessly. So if we think of photography as a tool of history, and history is a form of remembering, then we want to remember. But maybe a case can be made for forgetting because the past is so painful. And do we want a clean break?
Right. Yeah, I think that duality is something that everyone, who works on disasters struggles with in one way or another, because I think our intuitive answer is to say, of course we should remember, right? That, the kind of lest we forget line is probably the thing that springs to mind most readily. And the thing we probably hear people complain about most is that people forget about disasters too quickly, that the news cycle moves on, that we don't give it the due reverence. But, can a case be made for forgetting? I think yes. And I think certainly in Japan, a case has been made, if not entirely for forgetting, then certainly for moving on. And this centers really on the idea of what people have called reputational damage. The harm to a place, its goods and services that are caused by negative associations with a disaster. Mm-hmm. Now, all of us have kind of lived through a version of this. If we think about COVID-19 in the last year, right? There's a reason that we stopped calling it Wu flu or the Chinese coronavirus and started calling it COVID-19, or started calling it the Indian variant, changed to Delta, Kent to Alpha, South Africa to Beta, Brazil to Gamma. There was a broad acceptance of this idea that attaching locations or ethnicities to viruses can be stigmatizing and discriminatory. And a similar argument has been made in Japan about Fukushima, namely that association with the disaster makes life difficult for some of the survivors.
Absolutely.
And so this is an argument that's particularly advanced around foodstuffs. Both farmers and fishers often make this argument. It's a prefecture that's proud of its agriculture, particularly peaches, cucumbers, persimmons, among other things. But who wants to buy food made in Fukushima when the name Fukushima immediately makes you think of nuclear disaster? But then this creates a problem, right? It's not about memory and our responsibility to the past. It's also the effects of memory on the living, on the people that are still continuing to try and rebuild their lives, who are not only having to, in many cases, contend with the fact that they were forced to evacuate, abandon their land for a number of years and then return to it, but now have to face incredibly hostile market conditions where lots of nations, fewer and fewer each year, but for many years, nations embargoed produce from Fukushima, even if it cleared quite rigorous checks, and lots of domestic consumers, actively avoided food made in Fukushima. They'd go through the ritual of checking labels. And I know lots of friends and family did this.
Mhm.
You know, and this isn't a kind of fringe argument. It's an argument that has very much been taken up by the Japanese government, who've made it their mission to kind of combat reputational damage. And they've done this through investing in science communication, trying to educate people about all the various systems of checks that they've put in place for monitoring foodstuffs and levels of contaminants, but also in symbolic ways. Right? There's a reason that some of the Olympic events that obviously just finished a few days ago, including the baseball, were being held in Fukushima. And there's a reason that when the Olympic flame arrived in Japan and went for its tour of the country, it started in Fukushima prefecture. You know, the Olympics were supposed to be an opportunity for Japan to showcase to the world that Fukushima had recovered, that things had gotten better, and an opportunity to try and move on. So then you might say, so should we forget? You know, should therefore we necessarily move on? And of course, again, it's not that simple, because of course, yes, people are concerned about reputational damage, and some people, you know, there is a section of the population for whom that is their predominant concern. But there are, of course, other people, and I met many of them in the course of my research, who are terrified of being forgotten. You know, the last time I checked, I think there are still something like 40,000 people displaced by the nuclear disaster. Court cases are still being fought. And activist and citizen science groups remain heavily dependent on funding. So the question of whether or not we keep the memory of Fukushima Daiichi alive, and perhaps more importantly, like how we keep it alive, has very real consequences for people that are still living today.
So maybe the idea is that we're not going to forget, but maybe we change the way we remember.
Right. But the memory, I think, is always political. Right? There is a reason that we are remembering, and we are always remembering a version of that story. And that will always serve some agendas over others.
Absolutely, no doubt about it.
That was really interesting. I noticed that we're coming up to 6. Do you both have time to stick around for a couple more questions, or?
Sure.
Yep, I can.
So with the prevalence of photographs and the way they're repeated in media, do you have considerations either when taking or curating photographs to prevent desensitization to a topic? I suppose this sort of relates to the way that we remember things as well.
Boy, yes, I think so. And I think as a photographer, for me, I try and, I mean, it's challenged, but the idea is, you know, can I capture this differently than before, or can I make an image that just doesn't feel like the same images that we see all the time, again, desensitizing us. I don't know that I don't know that I achieve that, but I know that it's in my attempt to capture or create an image that feels different than the millions of photos of abandoned homes and abandoned schools and abandoned malls and abandoned things, in a way that it doesn't just become repetitive and desensitizing. That said, I think desensitizing is a huge issue when you are barraged with, as we are now, with thousands of images a day. I think it's a big topic.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think I'd entirely agree with your answer, Laura, in that I think in curating the exhibit, I was particularly looking for, and I think I was incredibly lucky with them who agreed to take part, getting these wonderfully talented photographers who tried to approach it from, a new, fresh angle. Often, sometimes, some quite challenging ones, but perhaps, because they are different, that you wouldn't necessarily glance at the image and know what it is. That, for example, one of the images that we were exhibiting is from Yoi Kawakubo's "If the Radiance of 1,000 Suns Were to Burst into the Skies at Once" series, where what he did was he had a specially treated photographic film, and film reacts to radiation, which, as a funny side story, which some of you may know, is how Kodak exposed the Trinity bomb tests, even when it was top secret, because it interfered with their film. But he went and buried film in little canisters in the soil in Fukushima prefecture for 3 months, and then has exposed them to create these truly amazing abstracts, which are breathtaking. I think they make you stop and draw you in, but I'm not sure that they're desensitizing, in the sense that I've not really seen anyone interact with the subject material in the same way. And I think I could say similar things for a lot of the different artists that we're exhibiting. I think the other thing, you know, as a curator, is that you're not just working with images. And, you know, one of the things that I've tried to do is to use the photographs as an opportunity to stage encounters. So the work of each of the photographers is accompanied by commentaries from policymakers, academics, civic scientists, and activists united by their engagement with the disaster. And these commentaries are going to be hosted on an online exhibition program, which we hope to launch a little bit ahead of the exhibition itself. So that, you know, if you want to engage with the image on a different level, you'll be able to log on and read, say, former British ambassador to Japan, Sir David Warren's thoughts on the work of Lyoko Shiger, or Harvard professor Sheila Jasanoff's thoughts on the work of Yoi Kawakubo, or activist Eileen Smith, who's also incredibly famous for her work with her late husband Eugene Smith on the photojournalist volume Minamata, a movie about which is actually releasing in UK cinemas this week. But she's providing some commentary, I think, on the work of Tom Davies. So I think even if some of the images are a bit more like, you know, even if you think, oh, maybe I have seen something a little bit like this, hopefully that'll add a new dimension. And then, you know, there are multiple audiences. Of course, there'll be the audience that comes to the gallery, but the other audience, and also my collaborators that I should mention, is that the project has been integrated into my teaching at the Munich Center for Technology and Society. And at every step of the way, I've been supported by 7 wonderful graduate students. Of course, you know, doing this project was an opportunity to bring them into contact with these images, you know, in a very different setting, of course, in the classroom. And of course, for them to have a say in how the exhibition was curated. And if you log into the exhibition program when it's up, you'll also have an opportunity to hear what they think about each of the images, which again, hopefully should give you a fresh perspective and a new opportunity to re-engage.
I think Mac has a good point. Context can make a difference in in attempting to not desensitize the viewer, putting it into, I mean, like this program he's put together, it really does, you know, kind of put a fresh sort of new perspective on some images that look very similar to other images. And so context can help. If you have that opportunity, I think that can help with desensitizing. Yes, absolutely.
Thank
so
you.
Someone's going to come in the door any minute.
Okay, well, with that, then I suppose I'll wrap up. Thank you both so much for being here this evening. It was a really thoughtful and fascinating conversation. And thank you, everyone.
Just to reach out to me for further conversation, you know, happily, you know, I'm happy to chat. It's a great conversation. It's Mac and I literally had conversations that meandered, and it was so rich. So I just want to thank you for this opportunity. And before 5 people come through that door, I am going to leave the conversation.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I mean, as it will be in London, and I know many Fulbright fellows will be in the UK. For those of you that are somewhere near London between the 25th of October and the 23rd of December, it'd be great to see you at the exhibit, including, of course, all our friends at the Fulbright Commission. And perhaps we could even organise for some kind of tour for.
Great for
would be great.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. And I'm going to zoom into some of the online stuff, Max, so you're not rid of me yet.
That would be fantastic. We've got to keep this conversation going when we're finally in the same country.
We've had a great time. All right, I'm going to go log off. So thank you, everybody. Bye now.
Bye. And if you've enjoyed today's conversation, we have a couple more coming up. So next week, we will be joined by two scholars who will be talking about football or soccer from both sides of the Atlantic. Then the week after, we will have two scholars who will be talking about challenging cancer. So those are the 17th of August and 31st of August, respectively. And then on the 14th of September, we have a panel on advocacy in health and education. If you want to keep up with what we're doing, you can follow us on Twitter at US-UK Fulbright. You could go on our website, which is fulbright.org.uk. As I said, you'll be able to find recordings on our YouTube channel for any of the previous events in this series and the upcoming ones once we're finished with those. We also right now have our UK awards just open for postgraduate and scholar awards. And we also are in the final week of recruiting for our civic science storytelling award, which I think ties in to some of what we were talking about today, this idea of storytelling and journalism and photojournalism. If you are a science journalist or you know anyone in science journalism, this is a fantastic opportunity to go and work at the University of Oregon in their science and media faculty. It's an 18-month opportunity for a UK-based science journalist to work on some really fascinating stuff with the Rita Allen Foundation, who will be sponsoring the award. So if you're interested in that, please go on our website. Please go into the USA and professionals and scholars, and you'll find the information about the award there. Thank you all again for joining me this evening. Thank you to Mac and Laura. Have a great rest of the week, and I will see you next week.